I'm Dr. Chris Talbot, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Dr. Chris Talbot from the University of Northern Colorado on the show. She's the author of Sonia Johnson, a Mormon Feminist. We're going to talk all about the controversial character. She was a bit of a firebrand, and so check out our conversation with Dr. Chris Talbot. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a professor from all the way from Colorado here. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are and where you teach?
Sure. My name is Dr. Chris Talbot, and I teach at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado.
A big sky school.
Is it now? I don't actually even know that.
Wow. You're not a sports fan?
I'm not a sports follower, and don't tell anyone, but we're not very good. So there are not a lot of sports followers at UNC because we're not very good.
Now, is it UNC? That sounds like
we do go by UNC. We call ourselves the other UNC. And our little thing in our email is UNCO to distinguish us from UNC. But we sort of go by UNC, the other UNC.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, very good. Well, I'm glad to have another person from Colorado. Of course, Matt Harris. A lot of people know him.
I know Matt.
He's a couple hours south of you in Colorado.
Yep, he is.
Springs, I think. Mm-hmm. Or Boulder.
He's in Pueblo, which is
Pueblo,
which is like a burb of Colorado.
Yeah, that's right. So it's good to have another mountain saint here.
There are a few of us.
So now you told me this is your first podcast.
It is my first podcast.
I'm excited to be the first. I just got the first AUB member on my podcast.
That's nice.
And so we're this is going to be the first of the year, so we're doing a lot of firsts here.
Okay.
So that's exciting. I always like to get people's background. I think are you a Utah girl?
I am a Utah girl. I grew up in South Salt Lake City, close to Murray. I went to Cottonwood High School.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. The Colts?
I did. I was a Colt.
Well, very good. And then bachelor's, master's, PhD?
Bachelor's at University of Utah. I have two of them. And I have one in history, focusing on America, and one in women's studies. And then I have... So I went straight into the PhD program at the University of Michigan, and the bachelor's is sort of this, or the master's is sort of this incidental step that just sort of happens to you on PhD. Okay. So I do have a master's, but it just sort of, you fill out a piece of paper and they send it to you in the mail. Okay. And then I have a graduate certificate in women's studies, also from University of Michigan, and my PhD from the University of Michigan.
Oh, so you're a Big Ten and formerly Pac-12. Now I guess we're Big 12. But you're not a sports fan.
I have a vague sense of what that might mean, but as far as it goes.
Well, very good. Well, I'm glad you're a Utah girl. I would say a Utah man, but you're not a man.
Yeah.
A Utah man I am, even sporting the red hair. So
I used to know the lyrics to that song. I probably can't remember them anymore.
Well, very good. Well, it's good to have you here. So you've written an amazing new book. Could you go ahead and show the camera your new book and give us the name of the book?
The name of the book is Sonia Johnson, a Mormon Feminist, and it is part of the Introduction to Mormon Thought series.
Okay. Well, very good. Very good. We're excited. You know, I have wanted to have a Sonia Johnson expert on for a long time.
We're hard to find.
And so I was excited because I attended your presentation at Mormon History Association.
I remember that, yeah.
And it was a packed session. I'm trying to remember if that was the one I was sitting on the floor for.
Oh, I don't remember that. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway.
Could have been, though.
It was fantastic. And so I'm excited to dive in. You know, I'm old. I remember Sonia Johnson. I mean, she's still alive, but I remember when she was like in the news, making news. But I think a lot of younger people probably don't know who she is. So let's dive into the book and tell us more about Sonia. How did she become famous?
So Sonia became famous for about period of really, really famous for a period of about 3 or 4 months, and then sort of tangentially famous for a period of about 4 years. The months were around, she was excommunicated by the LDS Church, and I'm sorry about the awkwardness of this sentence, but there's no other way to say it. She was excommunicated for her activities around the Equal Rights Amendment in December of 1979.
Okay. And so it was...
And why she was excommunicated is very contested. So I always have to say that sentence very awkwardly because I can't say because of her activities around the Equal Rights Amendment, or sometimes I'll say something like in relation to her activities around the Equal Rights Amendment. So
Okay. So it's interesting because it looked like the Equal Rights Amendment was on track to be ratified.
Mhm.
And the LDS Church played a key role in defeating that.
Yeah.
And that's what upset Sonia, right?
Yes. Yes.
Let's dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Give us more of the history of the Equal Rights Amendment.
So the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced for a number of times since the 1920s. It had been introduced by the National Women's Party right after the passage of the Suffrage Amendment. And it had been introduced sort of off and on several times over the 20th century. But really the first sort of more serious introduction was in the early 1970s. And at that point, it passed Congress fairly easily. As I hope listeners know, you have to pass Congress and then you have to pass 3/4 of state legislatures. And a whole slew of state legislatures passed it very, very quickly. I can't remember the exact numbers, but many state legislatures passed it very quickly. And then about the mid-1970s, conservatives began to sort of object to the amendment, and a discussion ensued about a number of things, one of which was whether state legislatures could change their minds. So if they already passed the Equal Rights Amendment, can they then sort of unpass it? The term for that is rescission. Can they rescind their vote for the Equal Rights Amendment? There was a whole discussion about that. And sort of the ERA came to the forefront of public discussion about 1975, 1976, and really remained there until early 1980s. It was defeated in June of 1982. And so there were a number of discussions, one of which was about this question of rescission, one of which was that when the original amendment had passed in the early 1970s, they had put a time limit on how long it could take to receive to be approved by all of these state legislatures,
which was the first time a time limit.
Which was the first time a time limit had ever been applied to an amendment.
So it had already passed earlier, and then the time limit came in later. Is that right?
So it had passed the Congress. Yeah. It hadn't passed the state legislature.
Right.
It had passed the Congress, and then the time limit showed up in about 1978, 1979. And as people were discussing whether or not to extend the time limit, because there was a huge public discussion about whether we should pass this or not, that was when the church made its sort of the first of a series of declarations in opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. They had been opposed. They had stated an opposition to it. Relief Society leaders like Belle Spafford and Barbara Smith had stated objections to it as early as 1975. Spafford, 1975, Smith, as she comes into office. And so the church had a position, but wasn't really particularly active until the question of extending the deadline showed up. And as the question of extending the deadline showed up, there was a church news article in the sort of an editorial, I think, in the church news that sort of said, we don't really like this, and we think it will undermine the sort of God-given characteristics of women, and sort of withdraw some of the privileges from women that they saw in terms of women's, sort of responsibilities in the home, and some of the protections that women received by virtue of that role. And so what's interesting is if you look at opinion polls, the Desert News did an article about opinion polls before and after this news article in the church news appeared, and you see a pretty massive switch, something like from about 60-something% down to a low 30% of people in Utah, of members of the church in Utah who support the amendment before the news article appears, are at 60-something%. And after the news article appears, that declines to 30-something%, 31%, I think.
Huh. Well, very interesting. So remind me, so the original ERA amendment passed Congress was in 72?
1971 or 1972.
72. So that would have been under Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold B. Lee era, I think. And so they didn't really have anything to say.
Yeah, I mean, there were probably sort of some in-house conversations that we're not privy to, and perhaps some local conversations. But the first sort of inkling of conversation I can find is 1974, 1975, and then the couple.
Which would have been under President Kimball.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my point was, Smith, of course, he was an ID, maybe,
Yeah.
he was kind of on the decline. So maybe we can explain just kind of health issues. That's why he didn't really say anything. Harold B. Lee, on the other hand, is kind of a very powerful, especially talking to Matt Harris, very powerful with regards to the race ban. Didn't have much to say about women on that issue.
Right. My sense is that he just sort of didn't really want any piece of it.
Okay. Just trying to stay out of
He
politics.
just is like, I'm just gonna let this one land where it lands.
And then I think he died in 1973. And so then it was President Kimball.
Mm-hmm.
I know I was talking with Taylor Petrie a few years ago.
Yeah.
He was talking about the show Mrs. America and Phyllis Schlafly.
Which I haven't seen the whole series. I've seen a bit of it.
I've seen a bit of it too. I don't think I saw the whole series either. I got most of it though. But and I know you're the Sonia Johnson expert, not the Phyllis Schlafly expert. But
I can talk some about Phyllis.
Yes. So, was Phyllis instrumental in persuading Kimball? Would you say?
It seems more that she was instrumental in persuading Relief Society leaders.
Oh, okay. Not Kimball.
She had come to Utah and met with Relief Society leaders in 1974, 1975, and that really got them sort of committed to thinking that this was probably a bad idea. That the equal rights movement was a bad idea. And it's really after that visit that you start seeing public addresses from Relief Society leaders. They're sort of like, I don't really think we want to do this. And it seems that those two leaders, Smith especially, Barbara Smith, were more instrumental in the LDS Church's opposition than Kimball himself. It seems they had to do not much work, but a bit of...
Okay.
I don't know if I'd say a bit of convincing, but at least a bit of sort of drawing attention to.
Okay. And so is it around 75 when the church said, is it Kimball or is it Barbara Smith? Would you say it's more influential
in the early years, 74, 75, in the early sort of objections that you see come from the Relief Society leadership for about the first 3 years. And then it's really 1978 as conversations about the extension ensue that the brethren start to issue public. Well, they're on board, but they don't really want to get into it. They're sort of happy to leave
they're trying to stay out of the politics.
To Smith, right? And some of it is because they seem to see it as a women's issue,
okay.
And so they're happy to sort of let the women run with it until the question of extending the deadline. Once extending the deadline comes in, they're sort of jumping in, really with both feet.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so Congress passed. So was there a deadline in 71, 72 when they passed the amendment originally?
Yeah, it was created with a deadline.
Oh, it was created with a deadline. Was that true with any other things like prohibition or women's suffrage?
No other amendment had a deadline to pass.
Okay. So that's very interesting. Okay. So 70.
And I don't know why they put a deadline on it. It would be interesting to find that out. I haven't dug that deep into that particular.
All right, that'll be our next interview.
It might be.
I've already got you booked. So 78 is when Kimball and Barbara Smith kind of put more official church weight behind, and so that's what basically infuriates Sonia Johnson. Is that correct?
That's sort of where the infuriation begins, yes.
Okay.
And then what happens is, so there's the Church News editorial, and then there's a letter on church letterhead signed by the First Presidency that's read aloud, as many of those sorts of letters are, that's read aloud in chapels across the country, that basically says something like, work together with people of similar mind against this amendment. And in response to that, LDS women, it's hard to know at the request of whom, and that's an issue that I talk about quite a bit here. The LDS women organize into sort of political lobbying organizations. They call them citizens councils, or they have various names in different states. The most infamous one, and this one is the Virginia. Oh, what's it called? It'll come to you in a minute. The LDS Virginia Citizens Council. I call it VACC. No, I can't remember that.
Okay.
Of it. I think it's Virginia LDS Citizens Council.
Okay.
And they organize and they meet and talk about how to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. And they organize, bus trips down to the legislature, to rally outside the legislature, to talk with legislators. They distribute literature about how to talk to legislators, what to say to legislators. And so they do a pretty active campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment. They distribute leaflets in church parking lots. They have deacons distributing leaflets to the congregation members, and bishops asking for donations.
Like with the fast offerings? I don't
know if it's with fast offerings or not. Okay. I don't actually know the mechanism, but they did have deacons in some states. And sort of, the degree of activism and the nature of the activism vary by state. And there are tons of files in both the MERA papers at Utah State and the Sonia Johnson files at the University of Utah Archives of some of these materials and reports of what's being done in each state. And that was one of the functions of it. So Sonia Johnson in 1978 founded an organization called the Mormons for the Equal Rights Amendment. And one of their functions was to sort of report back to the sort of centralized MERA folks about what's happening in every state against what the church is doing in every state against the ERA. And so it's a very interesting question because one of Sonia Johnson's sort of central troubles is, as she saw it, it was really the men. She says the men a lot. And what she means by the men.
She was the first one against the patriarchy, right?
I don't know about that. But what she means when she said the men is, she uses sort of shorthand for the men of the church, by which she means the centralized church authority using the lines of priesthood authority to sort of then convince women to do the bidding of the men. And she sees the men very much as sort of in a kind of centralized agreement with each other and very much sort of lockstep following instructions from their leaders, all the way up to the hierarchy, to a centralized committee called the Special Affairs Committee, which was headed by Gordon B. Hinckley. And so the questions, one of the central questions, the book doesn't really take a position on, but that's of interest to Sonia are the men doing it? First of all, who's the men? And second of all, is this being done by the men, and to what extent are the men sort of using the women for their own kind of political gain and their own kind of political position against the ERA? And to what extent are the women allowing this? To what extent are the women doing their own political labor or simply following priesthood instructions? And that's really the central question. And Sonia, of course, sees them as following priesthood instructions. And that is the thing more than anything that just makes her crazy.
Okay. Yeah.
It just makes her incredibly angry.
Well, what was...
So that was a lot.
No, that's great. Because I think for people who know Sonia Johnson, mm-hmm. I think everybody knows ERA, excommunication. Yeah. I think that's kind of the main thing, but then we don't know a whole lot about her. I was surprised to find out she was quite a well-educated woman.
Yeah.
So talk about her educational background.
Yeah, she has a PhD in education and a master's, I think, in English. And taught a lot of sort of writing classes and kind of literature classes. She taught abroad quite a bit at places like military schools or schools for various and sundry groups of Americans in many places like Samoa, Korea. She traveled a lot with Rick's job. Rick had a job. Yeah, her husband, Rick, had a job that required a lot of international travel. And one of the things that surprised me most about Sonia was the way that her faith sort of really blossomed in that environment, in part because of the lack of an institutional church. Sonia's faith was a very personal one and a very mystical one that sort of had a kind of direct connection to Jesus. And, she really rooted her faith in, or sort of envisioned her faith along the lines of her mother's faith, which was she says her mother was in constant communication with Jesus and sort of was praying nearly all of her waking hours in this kind of constant sort of conversation with the divine. And that was sort of really how she understood Mormonism, really, and an LDS faith, and in many ways how she practiced. And it was basically, her and Rick and their children sort of practicing Mormonism in an apartment in Korea or Samoa. And in that environment, her faith really blossomed. She did not do as well when she settled in Virginia and had to reckon with an institutional church.
So I was just looking over my notes, and I remember at the end of the book, and I shouldn't jump to the end, but to me that excommunication is so integral. But she was excommunicated in the same building as Kate Kelly.
Yes, isn't that fascinating? Just by
right?
fairly sheer happenstance, just a kind of bizarre irony. Yeah.
So all the rabble-rousers come from Virginia, is that it?
Apparently, that's what I hear.
So it's funny to me
ones.
Because Utah has its own culture, and if anywhere there's a big institutional culture, it's Utah. I served a mission in South Carolina, been to Virginia. I wouldn't view that as like an institutional stronghold, but I guess compared to Samoa and some of these other foreign places, it really was. And so it's funny to hear that she bristled against the institution in Virginia. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, she had grown up in Layton mostly.
Okay.
Logan. Logan, not Layton. She'd grown up in Logan, so she sort of grew up in the institutional church, but also had this mother who sort of really modeled for her this kind of direct relationship with Jesus that sort of didn't really go through the institution. She was very much in the institution and had some early feminist run-ins with the institution.
Her mother?
No, Sonia.
Oh, Sonia.
Had some early feminist run-ins with the institution, primarily around, you might remember these. Do you remember the modesty lessons around butter and roses and gum? And so
I don't think
the butter.
I think the women got those more than the men.
Yes, the women got those more than the men, and that was in fact the issue.
Licked cupcake. That's
the licked cupcake. Well, the butter is the licked cupcake. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's just licked butter. And that was actually the issue. Was that
some people might not know what these metaphors are.
So these metaphors are something like. At Young Women's, they would do something like in my Young Women's class, there was a rose, and you pass the rose around, and everybody manhandles the rose and picks a petal off and manhandles the rose, and then they compare the rose that's been manhandled to a rose that is fresh and beautiful, and which one of these would you like? Well, you like the fresh and the beautiful one, and so if you allow yourself to engage in various forms of sexuality, whatever those might look like, petting, making out, sex, whatever, then no one will want you because you are like the manhandled rose or the licked butter or the licked cupcake or the chewed gum.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was very bothered by that lesson, or by that lesson on lessons like it in two ways. Number one, she believed it to be false doctrine because of the notion of repentance.
Right.
If you can't ever become clean again, then repentance doesn't actually mean anything.
Right.
And so she found that lesson troubling in that sense. But the second sense was very much this double standard that women received this lesson in the ways that most young men did not.
Right.
And so, there was an instance where somebody was talking about licked butter, and she thought to herself, what about the boys' butter? So it was one of her sort of early kind of feminist stirrings. But at the same time, she's watching her mother have this very direct relationship to Jesus, and that sort of seemed to form the core of her faith much more than the sort of institutional church.
Okay. And I mean, today, even
institutional church just sort of came along with it.
Yeah. Well, even Elizabeth Smart has complained about the cupcake and the shooting gum. So these are still metaphors that we're still using. Yeah. And we talk about pouring shoulders.
Yes.
Where women, especially, but men too, aren't supposed to show their shoulders because you're supposed to be wearing garments.
Yeah.
And even for young women who haven't been to the temple,
right,
are wearing garments, are not supposed to have bare shoulders. And so,
because apparently men can't do math or function when women's shoulders are exposed. apparently that's
Yeah. So this is still kind of an issue. So that's interesting. So she would have been growing up in the 60s, probably 50s.
She was born in 1932, so yeah, 50s, 60s.
Okay. So she kind of had some feminist stories
1936, sorry.
in. She's really close to my parents' age.
Yeah, that's how I remember it. Actually, she was born the year my mother was born.
Okay.
I had my father. My father was in 1932, so I had a moment of confusion.
Okay.
But 1936, yeah.
My parents were both 39, so. So she had these feminist stories in Utah, but she got married and then moved all around internationally, and kind of developed her own spiritual relationship.
Yeah.
And then she gets to Virginia. Of course, I will tell you this. So I have some relatives that are from Maryland, and people who don't live in Maryland and Virginia don't understand how much Washington, D.C. politics is so talked about. Like, I know even in today's world, but I still think it's different because it's just.
That's probably true.
We're out here in Utah. We don't get quite the, play-by-play that Maryland and Virginia people get. And so I think that probably has something to do with it as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And so she ends up in Virginia. Church comes out. She becomes infuriated. Let's dive into some of the details. What are some of the things that she said that set off church leaders?
Well, let's back up a little bit to how she became infuriated, because this is a very fun story.
Okay.
So she'd been hearing, from the pulpit and in Relief Society and other places, she says something like, the church meetings had become a precinct meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And she felt that was very distracting from what she wanted from a church meeting, which was, religious instruction and spiritual communion and prayerfulness.
She's go crazy with the MAGA stuff that happens now.
So she found that very distressing, and she also didn't really understand why the church was so opposed to the ERA. So at some point, her congregation had a meeting with a sort of local kind of notable who was giving a talk about why the church opposed the ERA. And so she gathers up her friends, many of whom support the ERA, and so let's go listen to what this guy has to say. And, see if there's something we're missing or something we don't understand about the ERA that makes it more objectionable than we think it is. So she gathers up a bunch of pro-ERA women and go to this meeting. And the guy gets up and basically says, well, I didn't know anything about the ERA. So on my way to the meeting, I stopped at a 7-Eleven and bought a magazine that had an article in the ERA about the ERA. And I read it during the opening song. And now I'm going to tell you why we oppose the ERA. And she thought, you're scheduled to give a talk and you don't know anything. So you buy a magazine on the way to a talk. And for her, that really represented men's kind of indifference to women's issues. You're supposed to talk for an hour about why the church opposes the ERA, and you buy a magazine on the way to talk for an hour about this. This is your level of investment in women's issues. So she sort of felt like there was such a tremendous disregard from this guy, but she thinks of the men as sort of a kind of monolith, which is problematic, but nonetheless, and sort of sees this guy's kind of disregard for having this conversation as emblematic of the church's disregard for thinking about women, for caring about women's opinions, for listening to women, for caring about women's issues. And that sort of begins, and she finds herself rocking back and forth in the meeting saying, oh no. And that was sort of the beginning. She calls it the beginning of the end. So that was sort of really how she became converted to the Equal Rights Amendment. And she does talk about it in those terms of the kind of conversion.
Oh, wow. And so before that do we have any indication she was pro-ERA?
She says she thought of herself as mildly pro-ERA.
Okay.
Just sort of like, I think this is a good idea. Sure.
Okay. And I think Virginia was one of the states that did pass it right away, didn't it?
Correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore one of the states where the church citizens councils were fairly active.
Okay. And that's when that happened. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Chris Talbot And her new book is Sonia Johnson, a Mormon Feminist, award-winning book here on Gospel Tangents. You should definitely pick it up. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the conflict between Sonia Johnson and the LDS Church. So I know another big issue with church leaders and Sonia Johnson especially was when she said that you shouldn't invite Mormon missionaries in anymore.
Okay, so she didn't actually say that.
Okay.
I knew this was going to come up. And it's important to understand there.
Isn't that how the church interpreted it, though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I'm happy to talk about that. So it's important to understand the context in which she made the remark that that is under discussion.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please sign up for our Patreon, and as little as $5 a month, you can access the entire interviews. We can also show full videos and give access to collections. So sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents. Help support me to keep this podcast running.